Well, welcome everyone to this is our fourth webinar that we've done on AI, our second one with Kyle. So you can't you can't do first time long time fan first time caller. All right, so we'll play games with you, Kyle, in this regard. So we're thrilled to have everybody who's chosen to join us again. We do record these and share these afterwards with people, and those have been very popular for people to listen to and share around. I'm delighted to have Kyle Jensen from Arizona State with us again today on our follow-up conversation. It was our first webinar was with Kyle, and it was exceptionally powerful and went very well, and we decided we'd do a few more. So we're thrilled to have you back with us, Kyle. Thanks for spending some more time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's excited to see you.
So I'm gonna prompt you a little bit and let you go for as long as you want to go, but not too terribly long. And about the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is beyond detection.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. I was reading some things again this week about a paper about faculty being way overconfident that they can detect AI
Yeah.
in student work. I deal with that on a policy level almost, weekly here at the University of Leeds, where academics say they're using AI. It's like, are you sure about that? So there's lots of issues beyond detection as a topic. I know you'll be thoughtful with it. So, and then I'll have some questions for you. And then as people have questions who are joining us, please put them in the Q&A tool, and I'll start pulling those questions out. You don't have to worry about monitoring that if you don't want, Kyle. I'll pull questions out and feed them in as we have them. The better the question you ask, Kyle, the more likely I'm going to pull it, and the sooner I'm going to pull it. So there's some built-in incentives to ask a really good question on the Q&A palette. So with that, why don't I just turn over to you, Kyle? And so you chose beyond detection. Why don't we start with why you chose it and where you are with your thinking with regard to detection?
Yeah, let me clarify by what I don't mean by beyond detection, which is to delegitimize the concern with academic integrity. Jeff, of course, that ASU has one of, if not the largest writing program in the country. We serve a number of different students from diverse backgrounds. We have, I don't know, serve north of 20-some thousand students a year. So you can imagine that the concerns about detection are really strong. And one of the things that we try to do at ASU is to affirm that the concerns about detection are reasonable. Students sometimes use generative AI in order to misrepresent their work. And for obvious reasons, that's a point of frustration for many teachers. So I'm not, when I say moving beyond detection, I'm not saying teachers shouldn't care about detection, but what I am saying is that it has collapsed the kind of curiosity that we should be having about how generative AI functions. So you mentioned just a moment ago that there is research now where faculty are extremely overconfident about their capacity to detect generative AI usage. That's something that happens pretty frequently here in ASU writing programs. And there's a kind of unstated assumption when you believe you can detect it is, I know how this technology works.
Mm-hmm.
If you go through and you read the research from the engineers who are developing generative AI, they don't even know how it works. We're dealing with billions of parameters that are required in order for the large language model to create reliable output. And, we can argue about whether or not reliable should be whatever kind of criteria we want to use to do that. But the fact that it does create really thoughtful and coherent and oftentimes accurate output is kind of a marvel that should cause us to kind of pause and reflect about what it means to write, what role technology plays in writing, what role technology should play in our writing instruction. There's just not enough emphasis on the alien quality of this kind of technology. It just seems like it's too familiar. So that's what I mean by beyond detection. If we can say, yes, we affirm that concerns about academic integrity matter, but that's one very small piece of a much larger puzzle that we need to address in order to problem solve the relationship between generative AI and higher education in particular, then we can start to think in much more imaginative ways about what we ought to be thinking about and how we ought to be studying generative AI moving forward. And I'll give you a really quick example, and then I'll stop talking and you can ask another question, and hopefully I'll be on point with it. You mentioned just a moment ago, Jeff, that your son is attending law school at Emory, and there's this wonderfully brilliant faculty member there named Elizabeth Wilson, who's in the Women's and Sexuality Studies department. And she wrote a book in, I think it's 2012, called Affect and Artificial Intelligence. And in that book, she makes the argument that we have this tendency to not think of AI or the relationship between humans and AI as being affect oriented or emotionally related. We tend to think about the development of chess AI, for example, as just a purely logistical probabilistic activity. We don't have the same kind of calculation power that these programs do. And henceforth, we can fully expect that if we play a powerful enough software program, it will beat us because it's just more logical. And her research actually shows that there are really sophisticated emotional dynamics that take place between humans and AI as they're interfacing with one another. I wrote about this kind of phenomenon in my first book called Reimagining Process, where I said in general, we can talk about the role that students and teachers often play with one another, where students will throw up their hands and they say, I don't know how to do this. And us being well-intentioned writing instructors will step in and say, let me help you with that. I want to help take the burden off of this. And I describe that as a kind of an emotional dynamic, that we become the person who believes for the student, and to help them through the most complicated components of the process. I think that maybe one of the major points of frustration, whether it's conscious or not, with faculty and students is that instead of the student going to the teacher and saying, can you help me with this? They're going to a bot or a GPT to get the kind of help. The teacher recognizes that that help is limited. Maybe they also recognize that the help that they give is limited, but it's not facilitating that kind of emotional dynamic that's characteristic of the first year writing classroom. And so you feel like there's a real something significant is being lost. Students learn from the kind of emotional dynamics that we establish by going back and forth through feedback loops with us, with their peers, or whatever. And that seems to not be the case with generative AI. And so this idea of moving beyond detection is not to say, yes, there is an emotional dynamic there for certain, but to say, we don't really know what that dynamic is like because the technology is so new. It's facilitating a different form of interfacing between humans and technology that we haven't really seen up to this moment in history. And so the encouragement of moving beyond detection is to encourage my colleagues in the field to say, let's stop acting like we know what's going on, and let's actually be really good researchers and investigate what's happening with a fresh perspective, recognizing that this technology is actually really something very, very different.
That's fantastic. So there's two threads I want to pull through there. I want to come back to, actually, you started and ended with this notion of collapsing creativity as a real risk to what's happening right now. But let me come back to that because I want to talk about affect a little bit, and identity, because and really invite you to maybe go into Elizabeth's work a little bit more in your own work and think with us a little bit about the relationships between affect, identity, and teacher work. And so anybody who works with early career teachers or are on teacher change or teaching change knows that at the end of the day, it's identity work, and well, learning's identity work. So we don't escape identity work. But if we think a little bit about teacher identity and particularly how writing teachers, I think, have the kind of identity built in, or they learn it that you just described, how are you thinking about the changing nature of teacher identity in a learning process that now has a kind of alien quality to it, that you mentioned earlier? So let me stop there. I could go on, and there's other ways I could ask that question, but if that question makes sense, walk into the space of that question, if you would.
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that I have a very elegant answer, but I'm going to try and muddle my way through it, and you can tell me how well I do and ask follow-up questions based on what I say. Um, It's difficult to assess at this point what a teacher's identity is if the fundamental preoccupation is with detection. So I have a number of teachers who will say, I would use generative AI if I could count on the fact that it is a reliable tool that doesn't facilitate academic integrity violations. I wonder, like, if that's the first move to kind of it's what is historically characterized as a deficit model of learning. I wonder if we're really actually just talking about generative AI at all at that point, and we're saying, well, they just want to be able to sustain a framework of deficit thinking that like coaches students to respond in kind to whatever it is that they're prompting them to do. Maybe they want to be the person that's prompting the student writing, and they view generative AI applications as a threat to that. I have a number of other teachers who do really creative work with generative AI, and they think about their identity as a teacher in terms of problem solving and modeling what problem solving looks like, what modeling how students ought to approach the problem solving activity. And so they will do really creative things like say, well, in real time, one of the things that generative AI does is it multiplies possibilities. And when
Mhm.
you multiply possibilities, you have to make decisions. And when you make decisions, you have to justify your decisions. And you can see that happening in real time in class, and that becomes a way to model the problem solving process in ways that students connect with in a meaningful way. We ran a cross-sectional study, I may have mentioned this last time, of teachers who were deliberately incorporating generative AI applications into first year and upper division writing courses and ASU writing programs. And we found a couple of really interesting results. Number one, uniformly, everybody believed, all the teachers who participated said generative AI is an incredibly important technology that we absolutely need to train students to use effectively. And then there was an undercurrent of, but we still need to focus primarily on detection. We're frustrated that there's no detection mechanism. And so that tells you the kind of tension that this technology has created. On the one hand, you see teachers who earnestly want to prepare students for the future, and they recognize the value of the technology as it relates to writing and writing futures. At the same time, they're recognizing this tension that's making their job really difficult. It may be that at ASU, the labor conditions are such that, that kind of interruption to the normal flow of delivery is more acutely felt just because the volume of students that our teachers have to teach is overwhelming, to say the least. But I would say too that it poses an interesting tension, and that tension is how do we develop the kind of expertise that helps students prepare for a 21st century where these applications are definitely going to be in circulation. They're already, widely used. We need to develop an expertise, but we're working against a kind of deficit framework or a deficit mindset that compromises one's ability to develop that expertise. So what I've tried to do is imagine different ways for faculty to interact with students, using generative AI applications that kind of circumvent that preoccupation with detection. And I think part of that process is using the technology to facilitate conversations about generative AI. I've met with some of the students in our program, and one of the things that they said is we want to have conversations with our faculty about these issues. We don't know how to have them. Teachers, I think, don't know how to have conversations with their students, or at least some don't. And so the technology can help with that, but we can also just build better faculty development frameworks to support them as well. So I guess my overarching conclusion is there are some aspects of our identity as writing teachers that will necessarily change because we're dealing with a fundamentally different technology. And then there are things that are so profoundly permanent because we know as researchers that writing works best when you teach it as a process.
Yeah.
Uh, Students are more imaginative when we ask them to develop possibilities and make decisions from those possibilities. They can learn to break texts apart and analyze with greater sophistication. And if the AI can help with that process, that to me seems like a really exciting thing. That doesn't mean that we overlook all of the other potential downfalls to it, but I think that we need to also embrace the possibilities of what the technology can do and be much more active in developing those as teachers, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. I mean, I had a conversation, I don't know, 2 weeks ago with Sid Dobrin
Yeah.
about this, and Sid and I had probably more than one old man moment. And there's lots of identity change work that's involved with these teaching change moments. And the old man moment that we have, I mean, he and I honestly, I mean, for a little while we were kicking around whether this was really new in this sense, right? So he and I are old enough to remember the introduction of personal computing to writing and writing instruction, and some profoundly stupid, and they were kind of stupid at the time, studies about do students write better with PCs or Macs, or does the use of a computer improve writing? And then there was the introduction of the computer network, right, which was even more transformative. And prior to that, there was television. And so this is in some respects, this isn't really any different than the introduction of any other meaningful educational or technology that's used for educational purposes. In other respects, I think it is. I think it will prove to be fairly different. But we've been through these changes. So the old man moment was we've been here before. And in some respects, some of the ways that people are talking is exactly the way he and I have heard people talk since the late 90s about these things. So I'm not, you can respond to that if you want, but you don't need to respond to my old man moment. We do have a
I
question.
don't know. That's the one I wanted to respond to.
You feel free, but we do have a question here about the responsibility of the writing instructor and talking about AI usage with students when other disciplines tend to be much more reactive in a negative sense. I'm not sure I agree with the premise of that question, but we can play with that a little bit, because there's certainly places at this university where instructors are letting it fly, and not just much more open than some of the humanities disciplines we have here. But anyway, the whole question is, how do we what's the responsibility of a writing instructor when they're working with students maybe in the way in which you're talking about, but the students are getting something very different in other kinds of instructional environments?
I think the responsibility of the writing instructor, and this will tell you a little bit about how I think about the value of writing to the broader university, is to facilitate conversations with other faculty members outside of the discipline in order to come to terms with what's possible for writing instruction and technological usage when writing is involved. So, this is a long debate from, Sid and I trained with similar faculty, the same faculty, in fact, just at different institutions. And one of the things that I think he and I would say was pretty strongly emphasized in our education is that writing is an intellectual activity, and that it plays a formative role in how university education unfolds in real time. And I think that that's a really great thing. To your point about haven't we seen this before? I mean, one of the things that I consistently talk about when I'm running faculty development events, especially with historians, is where do we start the timeline for generative AI technologies? Because there are multiple starting points. And if we recognize that there are multiple starting points, it gives us a more precise understanding of where generative AI emerges in material history and what changes are actually occurring and when. So, do you start it with the Dartmouth conference in the early 1950s? Do you start it in 2017 when the Google engineers, had their big breakthrough with neural networks and how they process? The fact that we can talk about the implications of that for how the writing actually unfolds means that the burden of responsibility for education falls, at least partially, on writing instructors and writing educators. And I think it's a really powerful moment for our colleagues across the country to say, look, we've been doing this work for a really long time, and we have really thoughtful things to say about how to incorporate technology into the classroom. The number one thing that is totally mundane for you and I, but might be a game changer for many faculty, is the most useful function of generative AI is as a process tool, not as a product tool. So if we can talk in practical terms about which application fits which part of the process, that automatically shifts the conversation from how do we worry about whether or not students and teachers are, doing consistent work with these applications across time and start to teach one another about what kinds of applications are best suited at which stage in the writing process given the discipline. So to the person who's asking that question, I would say, hang out with your colleagues, sit down and talk with them, build an initiative of faculty collaboration and do that interdisciplinary work because as I've said pretty consistently, verbally and in writing, generative AI it's an interdisciplinary flashpoint. And in order to understand it, we need a lot of different types of minds to weigh in on it. And the humanists who have spent a long time thinking about what writing is and what humanity's relationship to writing is, have an important voice in that conversation.
It's really interesting. It made me remember when you were on the last time, you recommended the book The Maniac as a way of thinking about the history. I read that book. That's a crazy book.
It's a really cool book though, right? Yeah.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I think we were talking in a moment, when I answered your first question about the alien qualities of generative AI, that 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 quality is drawn into such clear relief at the end of that book
Yeah.
when Labatut is describing the process of this world Go champion like being completely dumbfounded and then walking away from the conclusion of the interfacing with this AI game player, saying, I walked away thinking that the thing I was most associating with creativity was not in fact that creative, and that the real creativity was happening in AI.
Yeah.
The cool component of that though is like he didn't not recognize the creativity. Our brains have the capacity to see the innovation in the problem solving of AI, and that doesn't diminish human creativity, it augments it.
Yeah.
And so, but it's really hard to do that when you're worried about, AI taking over or AI, basically creating all of the kind of like eschatological problems that
Yeah.
we're imagining.
Yeah, no, the end of the book is crazy, isn't it? So that is, yes, I was thinking about that when we were talking about alien qualities. We may come back to that, but I want to underline something you just said, which I think is really terribly important for writing teachers in this moment, but a challenge for other kinds of teachers. And that is the notion that we own process, right? And so fundamentally, if our writing instruction is genuinely process centric, and it isn't always, and it isn't always in places, then we leverage these technologies to support the process moments that we want. And Michelle Ebley just said, there hasn't really ever been writing instruction outside of technology anyway.
No.
And she's right about that. She also wants me to have an old woman moment, but I am not capable of an old woman moment, but I'm capable of having an old man, old woman moment with you, Michelle, anytime you want to. So we can do that. But I'm coming back to process because if we stay in process and we own process, then we have a little agency in a way that maybe some of our colleagues have forgotten that they or maybe aren't thinking through in terms of having. But I'm thinking also about so many of the assessment and instructional environments at my current university where there's no process whatsoever with students. There's just an expectation of product. And therefore, the technology there isn't a process technology, it is a product technology. So how are you just trying to avoid that in your own work and avoid your colleagues who have that problem? Or are you trying to work with some people on that? Because I think that's a real challenge at this university in some disciplines where in the instructional environment, there is no process. There is just content delivery and content delivery on the part of the academics and content delivery on the part of the students, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I was meeting with our Dean of Humanities last week to talk about the role that AI is playing, at the larger college level. And one of the things that I said, which I think might be helpful and consistent with the point that you're making, is that we have a tendency to blame generative AI for limitations in our existing pedagogy. And what process helps us do is it helps us differentiate what problems are actually educational problems that generative AI is placing stress on. And so it's by virtue of its presence in our educational ecosystem, we're now starting to see maybe that's not the best educational approach. and then which problems are actually generative AI related. Um, I have a friend who I met with yesterday who's an engineer for large language models, and one of the things that we spent a good amount of time talking about was we don't even really have a good sense of the capacity of large language models. A lot of our frustrations are tied to the way that the applications have been formed as products, not necessarily what the technology is capable of. And so, you know, if we kind of push back and we say, all right, process, like let's talk, like suspend the concern with generative AI for a moment. Can we talk about improvements that can take place in writing instruction across a university, wholly independent of the presence of generative AI? It sounds like at your university, that's something that can happen. At ASU, that's definitely something that can happen. And so the professional development doesn't happen in terms of, we need to incorporate generative AI in order to solve this problem that it's created. We need to talk in realistic terms about the limits of our current pedagogical frameworks that generative AI is placing stress on. And then once we kind of come to terms with that possibility, then we can say, well, do certain generative AI applications enhance a shift toward a process-oriented educational model? And I would argue, and I have argued, that's absolutely the case. Generative AI, I think I said this on the last time we met, is that I actually think generative AI is most valuable as a reading tool.
Yeah.
A number of our students really struggle reading long form for a number of reasons that we don't need to kind of chase that rabbit trail. Um, but generative AI has the ability to break apart texts. They highlight where they're drawing their summaries from. They're saying, we think this is important. They can help students develop curated paths through texts. They help students make texts more accessible. So rather than just kind of pushing back from the table and saying, this is academia and I'm not smart enough to do this, we can teach them how to prompt the application to make the material accessible to them. That is our responsibility as faculty members, and that responsibility obtains irrespective of whether or not generative AI exists as a tool. And I think for too long in higher education, and probably education more generally, there's been a kind of fundamental misalignment between what teachers expect and what students actually need.
Yeah.
And that gap is being exacerbated by generative AI, and the moving beyond detection moniker is trying to say, let's focus first on our pedagogical stance. Let's become better teachers, and then find places to incorporate generative AI as it's appropriate.
So I want to get to that collapsing creativity phrase you used earlier, but you talked about reading. So let's stay with reading for just a minute because I was having a conversation. You did talk about reading last time, and so I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago here and talking a little bit about AI and reading and the way in which I use AI to help me read, particularly a lot of the functional reading that I have to. I mean, I'm overwhelmed with the number of things. I can't read everything that I need to read. And it's been a pretty useful reading technology for me. I'm still learning how to use it and where I want to use it. But the challenge I got back was, hey, Grabill, we got a problem with our students just reading anything, right? So, and that's the critique that we see that I think is real, that in advanced preparation courses in the US and the equivalent in the UK, no longer asking students to read novels or read long texts of any kind. And so students' reading experiences are necessarily fragmented. And so that's the way in which they've normed. And so their ability to read and process long form text has been diminished by the way in which we've educated. So let's assume that that's true, right? I think in many respects it is probably accurate of the reading diet of students coming to university. I don't know whether you have any thoughts about the relationship between these new technologies, which might mean that students read less. I don't think that that's what that means, but talk a little bit about, because I know you've been thinking a lot about reading. Talk a little bit more about reading in the context of the challenge that I got from my colleague.
Yeah, so I would tell them a story about my daughter. So I think I mentioned to you before, I've got three little girls in our house, twin 12-year-olds, and speaking of aliens, an alien who's turning 10 in a week. She's an absolute troublemaker. But one of the twins is probably the most consumptive reader I've ever encountered in my life. Like if we don't know where she is, she's curled up in a corner consuming a really massive book. Um, she loves long form reading. She, reads the entire Harry Potter series, the entire Lord of the Rings. Like she's reading challenging books at 12 years old. And so because both my wife and I are educators, we understand that there are zones of proximal development, and she's kind of in a holding pattern. She keeps reading the same books over and over again because they're gratifying to her. She knows what the story is. She knows what she's going to like. It's like eating the same meal again and again and again. And I'm saying, like, look, if you want to get better at reading, you have to read things that are difficult, that stretch you a little bit. So I've been handing her what I think are accessible classics, let's say.
Oh, not Infinite Jest or something like that.
Not yet. Eventually, we have not tackled Infinite Jest yet. No, like little things like Pride and Prejudice, for
Yeah.
example, or like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the kinds of things that high schoolers will read, in their sophomore or junior year. And there is nothing that cuts off my consumptive reader and stops her from reading than encountering a text that she doesn't know how to negotiate.
Right.
It's like you have this voracious reader. She will read a book a day, and you give her something that she's really struggling with, and it stops her cold.
Yeah. That's
If
interesting.
that's happening with her,
Yeah.
how many students who are taught to believe that they're not good readers, who don't inherent, like her twin sister, you got to pull her by the nose to get her to read books. It's not something that is organic to her sense of self or identity or learning. She will read, and she's very bright, but it's a harder sell for her. So if we can say that a majority of our students are more like my non-consumptive reader than the consumptive reader, and that for my consumptive reader, that big barrier is I don't know what to do with this. Maybe what we should be doing is thinking in practical terms, not wringing our hands and clutching our pearls like, oh, our students don't read anymore these days, but asking a really basic question. What is causing our students not to want to read? Is it something inherent in the cultural ecosystem? Is it possible that, we who are high achieving readers who learn to kind of suffer through large volumes of texts have developed that kind of stamina and threshold, and we see the value in it, but it's a much harder sell for students who are really struggling. And if there are tools that can make those really difficult texts more exciting, more
Mhm.
accessible, why not use those to keep the ball rolling? I would much rather have my daughter read a summary of something and feel like, oh, that helps me make sense of this really complicated scene where the syntax is foreign to me, the topics are foreign to me, I don't really know. And maybe it pushes them forward in a thoughtful way. One example on this, I have a really wonderful colleague here. Her name is Ann Jones. She's the vice provost for undergraduate education. She's a brilliant chemist. And one of the things that she said when we had conversations about generative AI is, when we start to program curriculum in the natural sciences, there are terms that are effectively the same, that are used repetitively depending on the discipline, but they mean different things and they have different histories. And so one fundamental problem is that students will get confused when they take multiple classes within the natural sciences about what the terms actually mean. Wouldn't it be cool if you had a folio that you could upload all of this content into, and you can prompt the application to say, okay, there are going to be, a bunch of different uses of the term entropy in the contents of this folio. Can you differentiate them for me based on discipline and give me a very accessible explanation of why those differences matter? Maybe that's the intermediate step that we're missing to get students more invested in the problem solving process. I do agree with the assessment that generally speaking, our students tend to push away a little bit more quickly.
Yeah.
But I do think that it is also our pedagogical orientation toward reading that is causing some of that disaffection, for lack of a better term.
Well, and the interesting space we got in that conversation with my colleague is that where he and some of his colleagues have arrived, and it's on the one hand not a place they wanted to arrive, but on the other hand a completely comfortable place for them to be, is they have to teach reading again. And then I think that we forget that we have to teach reading. We have to learn reading over and over and over again. The more education you get, the more times you have to learn how to read. And I mean that in an explicit and intentional sense. I mean, I remember the first time I confronted, literary post-structuralism. It's complete gibberish. It's less gibberishy than it was. It's still gibberishy now, but I realized at that moment in time that I needed to learn how to read. I didn't know how to read. And I had a professor who was explicit, like, you don't know how to read this, so I'm going to lead you through it. And I think what these colleagues are realizing is that they have learners right now who need to learn how to read in a much more explicit, intentional sense that students, maybe for the last 10 years haven't had needed to learn. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's their perception. And they're struggling with whether these new technologies are going to be a help or a hindrance to that reading activity. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense. I'm teaching a graduate seminar. My last class is tonight, and it's an introduction into methods. And I framed the entire class as I'm going to teach you how to read in 3 dimensions. Like we have this tendency to want to say like this is either good or bad, and we're dealing almost exclusively in binary terms. Let's not think about in binary terms or zero-sum games. Let's think about how texts create worlds that we can inhabit and problem solve within. Students need methods on how to break into text. I think that's, for me, the real bottom line. How do you break apart texts? If we can teach students to do that and find something compelling, we can't teach students to be interested, I don't think. But we can show them how to do things with texts that are interesting, at least, if not to them, to us at least.
Yeah.
And then create a bridge toward the kinds of outcomes that we need to measure to ensure proficiency.
Yeah, and the interest comes and goes. I mean, my kids, I've got a kid in law school and a kid in a PhD program, and each of them in their first year, each of them are learning how to read because they realize they're confronting stuff that they don't know how to handle. They're motivated to handle it because they made this choice, they made this bed, they're going to lie in it. But it's been fun to watch them work through that. Okay, enough about that. So collapsing creativity, because early on you talked about what you meant by moving beyond detection was trying to resist this collapse in creativity. So I'm paraphrasing, put words in your mouth. Talk a little bit more about what you mean by maybe collapsing or uncollapsing creativity for us.
Yeah, for me, it really hinges on the concept of curiosity. So I'm writing a book about this right now, and like what educators can do to address the challenge that generative AI poses. And for me, it hinges on curiosity. And I think the temptation is to want to say, well, everybody's curious about generative AI. Look at the use cases, look at how much is being published about it, look how many people are actually incorporating it into their day-to-day life. But we forget that curiosity is a tension. It's a tension between what we know and what we recognize still is left to be learned. And so when we proceed as if we know what the applications are doing, if we proceed as if we know what they're being used for, that tension is getting collapsed, and we're not curious to understand, like, okay, there's 178 billion parameters. How does a computer engineer come up with that? We use phrases all the time like, well, it scraped the internet. Great. Tell me what that means. Like, if you're going to scrape the internet, what's the first step in that process? And more often than not, those kinds of tropes that we use to explain what's happening are really things that we're repeating from other authorities that we have accepted as true or not true, and we haven't actually gone in to investigate what does computational irreducibility mean. Like, when an engineer says that, what does that mean in practical terms, and how might that be applied to detection? So if we actually don't have a way to model how neural networks process input and output, do we have the ability to control it? If you want to negotiate that problem, that's great. Then learn the engineering behind it so that you can actually contribute in a meaningful way to the discussion, rather than just saying, this looks a lot like a search engine, so I'm going to act like it's a search engine, and I'm going to critique it like it's a search engine. I'm going to pretend, because I know what scraping something is that that's necessarily what's actually happening. In that regard, it's been really helpful for me. I'm really fortunate to have friends in the industry who can explain to me, like, answer my really dumb questions. Like, when you say scrape the internet, what does that mean? Like, when you say a large language model is an algorithm, that does not make sense in my brain. I don't have the ability to kind of to represent 178 billion textual parameters. But here's what's really cool. When we start to get down that line of reasoning, we find solid ground. I will sit and talk with my engineer friends, and they'll say, talk about information compression. And what they mean by that is taking really complicated things and using a shorthand term for it so that it becomes computable. We do this all the time as language users. We say, look at that tree. That is information compression. We could make it, we could expand it, we could collapse it even further. When we're talking about, anytime we use a metaphor to explain something to someone who hasn't seen what we are looking at, anytime we're trying to create intersubjective agreement. So I guess what I would say is, in terms of the collapse that I'm witnessing and concerned about addressing, it's proceeding with a little bit more caution and recognizing the limits of what we actually know. Now, one of the things that I say in the book is that it's an uphill climb, because in order to make the applications usable to a wide audience, a public audience, they've made them, from an interface perspective, very familiar. So they look
Right.
like search engines. They almost behave like search engines, and we're like, okay, I'm basically just querying a database and it's giving me information that exists somewhere. That is not how generative AI applications work. And so we kind of have to pause and say, well, wait, if it's not doing that, what is it doing? And that's a really cool place to be, because we see that a lot of engineers are asking, like, what is this? What's going on here?
Yeah.
And then we can find a place to have a voice in that conversation, which I think is important for our colleagues.
Yeah, and that interface problem is being compounded by actual search engines, or what used to be search engines, giving us AI search, right?
Right.
Um, but so let me ask you a couple quick questions, because I'm trying to not go an hour so that people have a little time to take a biological break should they need to before their next appointment. But we don't all have friends in the industry. So how should we manifest that curiosity in our individual work or in our professional development, and work with our colleagues?
Yeah, we should read hard things. I mean, like, um, I bought a book over the weekend for, Black Friday sale that is about the elegant math of machine learning. And I got the book yesterday. I was sitting with my engineer friend and I said, "You're going to love this book." And he's like, "Why?" And I said, "Look at this. There's all these formulas in here." He looks at that stuff and he's like, "That's the most basic thing in the world." But I look at it, I'm like, "That's a matrice. If you ask me what a matrice is, I'm really having to jog back in my education to really learn how to negotiate that." But I've learned to kind of lean into that space deliberately, so that when I have things to say, I develop a command over what I don't yet know. And then that oftentimes leads me into a space where I want to know more.
Yeah.
Will that mean that I'm taking, classes in linear algebra at ASU? It might. Am I going to take classes in machine learning from my computer science colleagues? It might. I don't know yet. But that I don't know is a really, really powerful intellectual tool that I want more of my colleagues to adopt. We don't know yet. We need to kind of move beyond our preoccupations with detection so that we can start to ask really basic questions, and to affirm there are real limits in what we know about this. And if this technology is poised to change the 21st century, like I think it is, and I think many people think the same thing, shouldn't we be getting involved in the learning process like most good teachers and learners would? That
Yeah.
seems pretty obvious to me, but it's a hard step to make.
What I love about that answer is you paired together curiosity and humility, which is a real superpower. So I appreciate that. But so here's my last question for you, and you don't have much time because people need to use the restroom.
Okay.
One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and it's not particularly insightful, is the relationship between effort and learning. And one of the worries is that, at least in the way in which we've done these things, and the way in which these intelligence have come into the learning environment, students aren't putting in the effort anymore, and therefore they're getting the performances that look like they learned something, but may not be learning anything at all. If you're thinking about the relationships between effort and learning, what are you thinking about it? How's that playing out in your work?
Again, I think we're proceeding a little bit too quickly. My encouragement would be sit down with students and actually talk to them about what they're wanting to accomplish. When I sit down with students at ASU, they want to have these conversations. They want teachers who are experts in helping them negotiate these technologies, a lot of us have not done the work that's necessary to develop that expertise and to communicate. Like we just want to be able to say, look, we have this expertise. This is what this expertise has traditionally looked like. There's this, problem in the middle that's short-circuiting that very clear process that we've become familiar with. Again, totally reasonable to be frustrated by that. I totally get that. At the same time, that causes us to assume too much about everything else associated with the problem. So sitting down with students and saying, tell me what effort looks like to you. Like, what do you want to learn? And how can we fit your learning goals into these larger disciplinary, methods that we incorporate in our research? And then once we get there, then talk about, well, can these applications help you along the way with that? Then it's what Ethan Mollett calls a kind of co-intelligence rather than, something else that we were kind of wringing our hands over. So in the book that I'm writing, the first chapter is a principle. It's like find a higher love. It gives me an occasion to talk about Steve Winwood, who I really like as a musician. That's going to be really funny. But the idea is simple, that in this moment of seeming crisis that causes us to reevaluate what we're doing as teachers, we have an opportunity to kind of pause and say, why am I in this thing? Is it to help students prepare themselves as agents in a wider public, in a professional life that brings them deep rewards? Does generative AI make that difficult? Yeah, it does. Does it compromise our higher love? I don't think so. I think we can find ways in that allow us to be ourselves, that allow us to rely on all of the good work that has preceded us, that allows us to be imaginative moving forward, and then allows us to look at our students and say, like, this is possible for you in the way that someone said that to us when the internet was forming, or, when, personal computers were a thing and we didn't know if they were actually going to help us learn to write better, and, whether or not we wanted to stick with a pencil as a long form writing tool.
Yeah, well, my version of that moment was when Pat Sullivan pulled me into a computer lab at Purdue and said, "Hey, I want to show you something that's going to change everything about writing, Jeff. It's called the web browser."
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, like, and those are the kinds of stories I think we need to kind of pause and remember, and talk about in proactive terms. I mean, you were joking about it being an old person moment, but one of the things I say really consistently to my students who get panicked about generative AI is history has a lot to teach us
Hmm?
about how we got to now. And if we can anchor those abstract worries to actual material circumstances, we can listen and learn from those experiences, then the problem solving process becomes much more manageable, I think.
Yeah, it does. And with that, we're going to call it to a close. So, Kyle, it was a real pleasure for you're generous. So thank you for spending some time with me and some time with us. We had a nice audience today, and we'll have another audience when we share it. And the feedback that I'm getting on these conversations, I mean, I've got better things to do with my time, to be honest with you, but I'm really enjoying myself. But the feedback we're getting on this is I think this is a real service to the field and to people who just want to spend some time listening and thinking together about something that I think we all understand is going to have a pretty deep impact on how we make things and how we learn. So thank you for the time again, Kyle. It was a real pleasure to spend some time with you. Maybe we'll do it again.
I'd love that. And for everyone in the audience, both, during the stream and then later on for the recording, if I can help you, find me. You can Google me, Kyle Jensen at ASU. I'd love to have conversations. I'd love to find ways to help you. We're all in this together, so we need to work together.
That's absolutely right. So thank you, Kyle. Thanks everyone for being with us today. And with that, go to the restroom. We'll see you. Bye now.